Hi, welcome to the Regeneration podcast. I'm Michael Martin with my co-host Mike Sauter. How you doing, Mike?
I'm doing great, Michael. How are you doing?
Good. It's been a crazy week. We started the week with no water. Woke up last Saturday morning and went to wash my hands, and there was no water. We were afraid we dried the well out, which was not the case, thank God. But it was a little weird for a minute there because you want water.
Yeah,
You really want water.
that's. I think you have an understatement with that. And let me ask you just briefly: if you take water from a well and it runs dry, do you goop up the drawing source? Like, even a fuel tank, we have fuel oil. If we let it run dry, we have to pay a lot more because they have to clean the intake.
Well, no, if the well runs dry, they have to drill a new one, which is expensive. But they didn't have to do that. The guy told me, he checked the well. He said, you have enough water for a couple lifetimes, so you're in good shape.
Great news.
So anyway, welcome to the podcast. And today it is a great pleasure for us to talk to Michel Bauwens, who now lives in Thailand, but was born in Belgium. And here's a little trivia. My first memories as a child are of my living at my grandmother's house in a Belgian neighborhood in Detroit. And you can, there's still remnants of the Belgianness in this neighborhood. There's even a Belgian restaurant where you can go feather bowling. So,
well, let me put my finger in geopolitics there and invite Michel. Walloon or Dutch? I had a daughter who spent a year in Liège, so I know the differences. And I would say, these are two completely different cultures. And since Michel is French speaking, he's a Walloon, presumably. Am I right?
No, actually, I'm a true Belgian in the sense that my father was Flemish from Ghent, and my mother was French speaking from Brussels. So not Walloon, but the French speaking from Brussels, which is quite different.
Yeah.
And so I'm a typical mix of, and in the beginning that's quite hard because the Flemish and the Walloons, they tease each other, and so you're always receiving the critiques on both sides, and you feel, you feel the pain from both sides.
I've always told people that I've never. Go ahead.
Once you get over it, it's so enriching because you have, the pulsation of two different cultures, the Northern European and the Southern European, and as you know, it's quite different. The Protestant Reformation, disciplined, interiorized Protestant mentality versus the we can sin because we can go to confession, Southern Southern culture.
That's great.
And Belgium is at that frontier and mixes both, and it's quite interesting to live there.
Yeah, well, that's great. Now, to tell our listeners, Michel is the founder of the P2P Foundation, correct? Which P2P stands for peer-to-peer.
Right.
And it's really fascinating work that Michel is doing, and I'll ask him to explain in a second. He's also the author. Now, on Wikipedia, they have 3 of your books listed. One, it looks like one in Dutch, one in French, and one in English. The one in Network Society and Future Scenarios for a Collaborative Economy. Because this is Michel's work, is seeing what the internet could actually be used for the good of humanity. Am I correct?
Yes, well, I try to look at the bad as well. But,
the bad is making itself known. Yeah. So, Michel, why don't you explain to us your work with the P2P Foundation and tell us why that's a good thing for people to think about.
Right. Well, okay, I'll just give you like a minimal personal background. I'm a kind of a working class person. My 2 parents were half orphans and orphans. My mother was illiterate. We were very poor when I was a child, and then I'm a child of the welfare state. Got free education, free medicine, and my father got an interest-free loan to buy a house. but I was quite rebellious when I was young. I was actually a Marxist, a Trotskyist to be precise. And then I noticed, that wasn't working. And I said, okay, if I can't change the world, I have to change myself because I would not be happy otherwise. And I started doing personal work. Then I had a spiritual phase. And then when I was about 30, I thought, okay, I've done enough of myself. I need to, bring some creativity in the world and do some good stuff. And I became an entrepreneur, like a progressive entrepreneur. But I ended up, working for British Petroleum, working for United States Information Agency, working for the biggest telco as a internet strategy director. But as the mid-90s came, I just felt that, all the indicators were going red. Like I didn't see that the world was going in the right direction. And so I thought like, maybe I should reconnect with my youthful passion for change, because I think where I am now working for these big companies, I don't think I'm part of the solution. I think I'm part of the problem. Mm. And remember, if you remember, 95 is the time of the, Seattle demonstrations, Zapatistas. So there was like a return of, some kind of like challenge to the system. But my big question was, okay, so Marxism didn't work for me, and obviously didn't work for the world as well. So how do we change? So that was my big question. And so I took a 2-year sabbatical to study transitions. And, I planned to look at those transitions, but, 2 years is actually quite fast. So I ended up mostly focusing on the Reformation and the end of the Roman Empire, which was, already a big chunk enough. And I came up with this idea of seed forms, right? So that basically you have like a relatively stable system. You have some crisis of complexity or differentiation. The old institutions are no longer able to keep it together. The ideational glue is no longer working to keep the society together. You get a polarization, you get a crisis. And the new, for me, came from these seed forms. For example, you think about the capitalism. Okay, well, purgatory, right? Purgatory. I mean, at least there's one historian that documents that in a book, Jacques Le Goff, who shows us, purgatory allowed Christians to do business. Before usury was actually defined as interest. So
interesting.
The Jews were doing, the Jews were doing, the banking, and then as the cities grew, there was a need for more capital, and so this pressure, and then so purgatory allows, it is defined as a minor sin to do business and to lend money, and so you can pay back your sin. And interestingly, that's already an accounting system, right? So purgatory not just ushers in like the capacity to do business in the cities, but it's actually itself a way of thinking that is an accounting system.
This is worth the price of admission already. This is live.
And so then you have the printing press and, the inventing of a double entry book accounting by a Franciscan monk. I forgot his name. Mm-hmm. So these are seed forms, right? So these are people that are leaving feudalism, settling in the cities and trying new things that are outside of the feudal system. And then they will interconnect. For example, businesses will be created using the printing press because it's light machinery, and these people are starting to travel around the cities and spreading the message of the Reformation, for example.
Right.
And it goes so fast that the church is no longer able to control that flow of new ideas. And so if you ask the question then, well, what today are the seed forms? And so my argument, that this is something I had seen before my study, but I kind of put two and two together. Well, peer-to-peer. So so if you define civilization as a way to organize city and country, right? The city as a managerial core, and then the city and the country as producing food surplus. So civilization is a particular arrangement between agriculture and knowledge, based on writing and then printing, and it's territorial. with internet, what we get is a many-to-many, point-to-point, peer-to-peer communication medium that is deterritorialized, right? And so basically, I think this challenges all the, the premises of our civilization, because what we need to do now is find a new arrangement between territorial arrangements and non-territorial arrangements. And I think this is new. So you could say that there have been like 3 civilizational types. The first one was Mesopotamia, Egypt, Persia. Then the Greeks invented like the mythic rational. They added rationality to the mix, which is probably to do with the alphabet. There's people who make the linkage between the alphabet as the tool that made that possible. Then industrialization could be like the third phase, starting in the 1600s, a new type of nation state-based civilization. And I think now we're at the cusp of the fourth. And I call this the Cosmo-Local Civilization, because I think, so I look at Ukraine and the conflict in Ukraine as a struggle between the rentier capitalist system of the West, the maritime financial power, versus the state sovereign Eurasian continental power of Russia and China.
I look at it the same way. Yep.
Right, and every world war actually has been a war of systems. You look at World War I, it eliminated the empires, and it kept, for the first time, only nation states remained. You look at World War II, it's a war between fascism, communism, and parliamentary capitalism, right? And I think Ukraine is, even though we're not fighting it with arms, it's very localized in terms of military, but I think it's a world war between 2 systems. One is characteristically using financial weapons, and the other one is characteristically using military weapons because it cares about land. It's, they're sovereignist. Right. But both are based on rivalry, so both lead to war. And so the cosmolocal idea is that we need to relocalize our economies because of thermodynamic realities. We spend 3 times more transporting goods than we are making them. So just by relocalizing, we can save 3/4, 2/3 of matter energy. And so in other words, maintain complexity as we go down, right? And I think this is the challenge. So if you follow my reasoning, so you have a crisis of complexity and differentiation. This leads to fragmentation. Fragmentation leads to polarization. And there is always a party that wants to go back to simplify the civilization. And I hope you won't be offended, but I think the Christians did that in the 5th century. I agree that Christianity created a great civilization.
They're doing it now again. Don't you agree?
Oh, yeah. Well, okay. I think we can return to that because this is the thing. Okay, cosmo-local is not the same as local. I will make the point later, but I just want to say that. So you have the pagan church versus the Christian church, right? And the Christian church wins, but it is to some degree a simplification of the civilization. Yeah. In all ways, like the roads, the ceramics, the books, the dogmas versus the pluralist philosophical schools of antiquity. However, the Reformation, where the Puritans are this force, they don't want ungodly people in power. So I think capital state nation as the answer of Hobbes and Smith and others, to this three centuries of strife, is actually an escape to a higher level of complexity, because religion remains free and differentiated. It's not abolished. Mm-hmm. So they retain the complexity and create something that contains it. So I think that was, even though I'm very critical of capitalism myself, I actually think that in terms of complexity, this was like a higher level of complexity, whereas the Christian change was a lower level of complexity. And and it took 5 centuries to establish a complex civilization. And I've come to the conclusion that I call it the pulsation of the commons, which is that you have these extractive periods of history where markets and states are oriented towards conquest and growth, and expanding territories, expanding matter and energy usage. They overuse their regional boundaries. There is disintegration and collapse. And as that happens, the people, allied with spiritual reformers, go back to the commons. And they heal and regenerate their territory. It doesn't always succeed, but it often does. And paradoxically, by creating a new surplus, they recreate a new wave of extraction.
Fascinating.
Okay? And so this is documented by Peter Turchin in Secular Cycles for Agricultural Civilizations. It's documented by World Systems Theory. They call it Phase A and Phase B. It's documented within Capitalism by Polanyi.
Michel. Peter Turchin,
Okay.
his last name. How is his last name spelled? Peter Turchin?
Yeah, Turchin is Turchin.
Okay, great, thanks.
Yeah, it's a very interesting person, and he created a database of world historical facts. And so they're trying to, really base their history on material and empirical basis. So Polanyi does it for capitalism, right?
Sure.
Karl Polanyi, the Lib Lab cycle. And so what happens, in my view, is that whereas agricultural civilizations would collapse, capitalism has serially exhausted frontiers. And so it appeared as if that pulsation was overcome. But then it reaches the level of global planetary overshoot. And that means that we have to abandon the pulsation itself. This is very important. We can't just heal it for once. We actually need to shift to a civilizational model, right? And so that brings us from not just the fourth civilizational era, but actually to the second eggshell revolution. Because civilization is also an extractive relation to nature that we somehow have to overcome. And so create kind of a permanent, method of exchange with nature that doesn't exhaust it,
right,
that maintains the web of life, that maintains diversity. And we can do this within the present paradigm. And so there we were talking more about also like even consciousness change and, looking at the world in a different way.
Right.
I can't anticipate all the details of what is happening, but I think this is why the current crisis is so difficult, because it's almost inhumane what is asked of us, in terms of like change.
Now, this is fascinating to me because, in a way, what you just described was a biodynamic farm, right? A regenerative thing in relationship with nature. And this word you use a lot in your work, commons, which I know that this is, in my, I'm a scholar of 17th century English literature. So commons is a big word in English literature because of the enclosure laws that happen. So when you use the word commons in reference to peer-to-peer things or the internet, what do you mean by that?
And one quick thing, I'll tell our listeners, I've got to run to a funeral in a little bit, but I'm going to be listening to this. I'll be a listener to the Regeneration podcast more than a participant. But if sometime later in the conversation, Michel, if you're familiar with it, at the Vatican, they have the Pope's Council for Inclusive Capitalism. I wonder if you're familiar with that, and if you don't hold back. I'm not looking for you to beat up on it, but it seems to me just filled with the regular rentier capital.
I'll touch the subject. I will answer the question by Michael, and then if Michael reminds me, I will talk about. I actually am a big fan of the social teaching of the Catholic Church.
Absolutely.
And I think it's very close to peer-to-peer. So I actually want to explain this because, you have this particular audience.
Yeah. Great.
Thanks.
Great.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mike. It's really great to have met you.
You can start talking.
All right. So, Michael, the question was about the commons.
Yes.
So I define the commons as three things in one, which is, like the Trinity. It's a resource that is created, managed, or protected by a community or a group of stakeholders. So that's number two, using their own regulations. So these three things have to go together. So it's something, right? And I say it's something because people now are using the common, and it becomes quite metaphysical. I say, no, it's not the same. The commons is a thing. It can be an immaterial thing, like a collection of open source code or a knowledge commons, right? But it is a thing. It is something that is productive. Then the second aspect means that it's a choice. It's an activity by humans. So some people think that certain things can be commons and other not. No, I think it's a choice. So it's easier to do certain things as commons, and it may not be optimal to have everything as a commons, but basically it's a choice. Like, how do we treat a particular resource? Do we treat it as a state resource, as a public resource, as a private resource managed by private property decisions, or do we actually choose, the third way, which is a collective, collective management of the resource? And then the third is the own regulations. So the people make their own rules, and that means that the rules can be very different, because a commons is an object-oriented relationality. So you relate to each other because you love something in common. You want to make open source, you want to make a new type of knowledge, you want to have an urban garden that you manage together, cooperative housing, shared transportation, but there's something that binds the people, to the, and so it's an institution, just as the market and the state. For me, the commons is an institution. And this is, why I talk about cosmolocalism, means a common-centric civilization, right? So in other words, you don't abolish private and public spheres, but you bind them within what I call magisteria, that are cosmo-local, global, translocal institutions that are able to protect a resource base or a web of life.
Right.
Right.
Now, what do you?
That's the shift.
So who would be this trans-global organization that would kind of oversee this? That's for me the big question, right?
So it could be two things. It could be a civic organization, which is purely civic, or it could be multi-stakeholder. So I'll give you an example. So in Italy, they changed the constitution to allow subsidiarity. It's called the Rodotà Amendment. That was done like 20 years ago, I think. And then Bologna used that to create the Bologna regulation for the care and regeneration of the urban commons. And so basically the formula, I think it's brilliant, allows any group of people in a city to say, we want to care for this particular resource. Like an abandoned plant, or a park that has been, not cared for well by the city, or cleaning up the Tiber in Rome.
Mm-hmm.
And so they go to the city lab, they make an agreement with the city, and that's called a Commons Accord. And, for example, yes, you can manage that park. You can even have pigs for the children, but you have to take care of those animals according to city rules. So they both sign that contract, and that gives legitimacy to the commons. And Ostrom, who is the big economist who studied the commons, she says that yes, the commons are autonomous, but they have to have agreements with public authorities, because otherwise they don't have legitimacy and they can be destroyed by the police, right? So you actually need some kind of agreement between the relative autonomy of the commons and the larger political regime that is dominant, right?
And that kind of
let me
begs
just
the question.
finish because it's important.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So the what the city does in Italy is they direct something that they call the Quintuple Helix, and the city, the commercial sector, the research sector, and the formal NGO sector. Those four will help the fifth sector, which is the common-centric civic initiatives. And that has been replicated in 250 European cities, Italian cities. and has mobilized 1 million Italians doing urban common, right? So I think this is a very interesting way forward. And what I imagine is, and this is my answer, is, well, this should be fractal, right? So you have that at a local level, but if, let's say you do Airbnb instead of Airbnb, you know Airbnb, right? And
Right.
it produces gentrification. So a new model is called Airbnb. It already exists, it's very small, but it exists. And you could say, well, it's in the interest of cities to create and support Airbnbs instead of Airbnb. But if you do all the same, well, why not ally? So then you could have like a city coalition, right? And so what you would have is fractally the same structure at the trans-local domain. In this case, it wouldn't be a purely civic organization like, the FLOSS foundations are purely civic organizations. Well, actually, they also have companies in them, like Linux Foundation and Drupal Association.
Right.
So these are these trans-local domain organizations that manage the infrastructure of cooperation of open source projects. Well, I think we need something similar at the level of mutualizing urban provisioning systems. And so it would coexist at the local level and at the trans-local level, right? Mm-hmm. So we have international state organizations like the IMF, the World Bank, the UN, and we have transnational capital. What we are missing, and that's what I call the commons gap, are trans-local civic or multi-stakeholder organizations that can protect the commons, human and extra-human.
Right.
This is the task I see as very important that we don't have.
Right. And that's what I was noticing, as I was going to bring up, is that knowing the history of the commons in Europe, they disappeared for a reason. And it's an interesting, I'm sure you've read the literature. Some of the literature suggests, well, the peasantry wasn't really making good use of the commons. So the government came in and took over, right? Which was not really the case. It was that people wanted the land, just like with the visitation of the monasteries in England during the Reformation. Right. They wanted the land and they took it away. Right. But they had the reason they took it away was not the reason it was given.
Yeah.
So, and to me, that's the danger with this idea. I mean, I like this idea enormously, but and I don't know what to do to prevent that from happening. And I think we see it happening with the internet now. And you mentioned when your work started in the 90s, or you started thinking about some of these things and introducing them. And we remember the early 90s and late 80s with the internet, it was a much freer domain than it is now.
Yeah.
So what do we do?
Well, I don't have any easy answer to this. So that's one of the reasons that I'm reading a lot of macro history right now. So I took after 20 years, I took a new sabbatical during COVID, and I'm starting to read, Spengler, Toynbee, William Irving Thompson, Gene Gebser. I'm going to do all of them. May last 20 years now, but I'm committed to read all of them. Sorokin, Sarkar, Aurobindo, Teilhard de Chardin. I just want to absorb their insights, and so classically this is Toynbee, right? He would say that the last stage of an empire is a universal state, right? It's basically an ethnic group that conquers and then says, okay, now we're too big, we have to give citizenship to everyone that we conquer. So that's a universal state. But then usually after 2 centuries, universal states start weakening, and that creates the universal churches. So the what he calls the internal proletariat, which no longer feels protected and cared for, self-organizes, around spiritual revolutions and new ways of seeing the world that carry the loyalty of the people. right? And then you have what he calls the Völkerwanderung, the nomadic crisis. So the universal state is no longer able to protect its borders. It gets overrun. But these tribal forces are not able to manage a complex society, and so they need to ally with the universal church.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's a big question. What is that universal church?
Right, and I think
I don't
your
have
work...
the answer right now, but I think that there's plenty of new spiritualities emerging, including a revival, of course, of the old. Like that's what you represent. I listen to you and I listen to New Polity. I really like what they're doing as well. I don't know what you think about them, but I
don't
think
think
that
I know them.
Oh wow! Well, so New Polity is a group of social Christians, Catholics.
Okay.
And they just created St. Joseph College, and so
I haven't heard of these guys.
Well, yeah.
I'll definitely check it out.
Yeah. No, they're very interesting because they're sophisticated. They're not just like neo-reactionaries. They are people who study Ivan Illich.
All right.
And they studied Judith Butler to criticize her, but with knowledge, right? They just don't say stupid things about Judith Butler. They actually read her. So they have, because like Jordan Peterson, which I find very interesting on comparative mythology and comparative religion and Jungianism and clinical psychology is a great professional. But when he talks about postmodernism, he hasn't read it.
Yes.
And that's
superficial.
It's superficial, right? Yeah. So these guys of New Polity, they're real intellectuals, and I don't think they're like reactionary in the political sense, like some other Catholic thinkers might be. They're more like Catholic worker. So they, of course, they're culturally conservative and anti-abortion and all of that, but they are politically and socially, sympathetic to the working class.
Yeah, which is where I am, and I think I have taken from the very beginning of my encounter with your work, there's kind of an unspoken spiritual dimension there. It's the third, it's the third not given, but it's there. It's definitely there. And now when we talked, and Mike was mentioning earlier when we first got online here, our friend Guido Preparata. And Guido is a kind of a Christian anarchist type, and certainly Mike and I are sympathetic in that direction. But his criticism of Christian anarchism is that a lot of Christian anarchists are like the Amish and kind of reject modernity and technology and things. And I think it's a valid criticism. My question, I've been actually puzzling over this for the last few days, is the idea from Václav Havel and his contemporaries of the parallel polis, right? The parallel structure of society. Are you familiar with this? Yeah. And so
not really, no, not
well,
really.
it really speaks to your work. It really speaks to your work, because what Václav Havel did, this is when he was still a dissident in Czechoslovakia. He and his circle, and they also did it in Poland. They had, they were living under oppressive communism, and they said, well, enough's enough. Let's live how we want to live in a parallel society to this society that we can't deal with anymore. So they started to live as they would live, so it's almost like in a Philip K. Dick novel where you have these parallel societies that aren't even aware of each other in a way. And so they started this, what Guido was saying was that you don't want to reject technology, and which speaks to your work and the internet. But my question was, well, then how do we develop a parallel structure? And because we've seen over the last couple of years the tendency of the big internet companies and search engines and so forth to impose limits on exactly the kind of peer-to-peer phenomenon you're talking about. Yeah.
So first of all, they're no longer peer-to-peer in their essential structure, right? They're peer-to-peer at the front end as kind of an illusion, but they control they hyper centralize and they own your data, and they have algorithms and they control what you see and what you can say. And I'm a curator. I've done that all my life, and I've been doing it like 20 years on Facebook, or maybe not 20. I don't know. When they started.
15
I forgot,
probably, yeah.
But I've been there like a long time, and it's become awful. It's become awful for two reasons. One is their own censorship, and you can't say anything about COVID. You can't say anything about the Ukraine, and there's like a number of you can't say anything about wokeism. So there's these topics where, like you can't say grooming anymore on Facebook, on Twitter, and Reddit, right? The word grooming is banned, and now they said, oh, biological males is a bad concept.
Yeah, right.
So so they just it's Orwellian, right? It's Orwellian.
Newspeak.
And so what I appreciate on the right side of the political spectrum is, because they were the first to be targeted, they are also the first to actually create alternative tech. Because the left is talking about it forever, but there's nothing there, and there's nobody there. And then you see locals, for example, which is used by conservatives. It's very popular. It's used. And so I don't think that's a bad thing at all. Like Ulbit from Curtis Yarvin, which is like a totally peer-to-peer structure, and it functions. I'm a big fan of Holochain, which is more on the progressive side, but it's still not there. And then you have the thing that some successful like hidden technologies used by progressives, but then they become woke, and so you have this wonderful P2P technology, but you can't say anything.
Yeah.
So I think at this stage we are at the stage where that's a good thing to build, protected alternative spaces where you can at least think, because that's the problem, is that they are destroying our ability to think. Literally.
I totally agree. And this is what I was, when you mentioned in early 90s, I remember even not even maybe 12, 15 years ago, Google was a free place. In fact, when they started to digitize these old books, remember this? They were digitizing, which, was very useful to a scholar of the 16th and 17th century. They were digitizing books from that period and making them available for free, which to me, that speaks to exactly your project. But then they started to tighten the purse strings on that. And not only that, but
I don't think it can be destroyed. Fundamentally, it's like print, right? So you can slow it down, but fundamentally, that level of differentiation is not going to disappear. And I think what they're doing now is like a 3-step strategy. First step strategy is unify the narrative, right? So all the mainstream media at the same time repeating the same thing. And it started actually with Occupy. I don't know if you know this, but
yes, I did.
At the end of Occupy, the Ngram system of Google shows that all the mass media started to use woke vocabulary massively, really a hockey stick. And there's a book about it called Woke Inc., where a venture capitalist described that Capital had, because it was a 1%, it was directed against them specifically. And so when they saw the woke, there was a black group calling Sanders out for being white supremacist, they said, aha, this is what we need to do. This is the people who will save us, right? So they started supporting. And since that moment, that's what they're doing. They make a decision. I don't know where and how that happens, but there is a consensus, and they will all repeat it endlessly, the same thing.
Build back better.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a great example.
So the second level is then use algorithms to make it difficult to access the alternative narrative, right? And they do those things together. And then I think the third step is cancel culture.
Yeah.
When 1 and 2 doesn't work, mobilize the mobs to destroy people.
Yeah, and you have
one
experience
step, one
with that,
step,
right?
2, and 3 is very effective to a certain degree, but it actually doesn't help. They are still losing legitimacy. They're still losing trust. And in the end, the woke neoliberal compact is not realistic. It's there's a guy called Earl Thompson, which I recommend reading, and he talks about the role of ideological cartels. So what you have is you have the 1%, and they have the money, but they don't have the manpower to rule.
Right.
So they need the 20%, the professional and managerial classes. And within the managerial classes, there is ideological struggle.
Mm-hmm.
For example, in the 70s, you have the oil crisis and the energy crisis, and the Keynesians are unable to give an answer to this. They just want to spend more, and then you got inflation. And their toolbook doesn't work anymore. And suddenly you have this small group, the Mount Pelerin Society. Okay, these are the people we need, right? And they started promoting them as neoliberals.
Right.
And then in the 80s, they come into power with Thatcher and Reagan. But an ideological cartel can actually destroy a society. And the example he gives is 17th century Holland, where, I don't know how they were called, but some bourgeois ideologues told the government, abolish the guilds. They're good for nothing. And they did abolish the guilds. And then the working class refused to serve in the army because they had no reason to. As long as they had the guilds, they felt they were protecting themselves, their interest. Without the guilds, they didn't want to go to war. And Holland lost its hegemony, right? And I think wokeism is a panic reaction, but it's going to lead to a wave of neo-reactionary working class movements.
And it is,
like
it's doing that right now, right? Yeah.
Canadian truckers, Dutch farmers,
right,
yellow vests. And what you see is that the populist right has become the working class party.
Which
the workers that vote for them,
yeah.
right? And now they're losing the minorities because you have within the PMC you have the ideological class, academia and media, and they're happy with wokeism because it's a guarantee for for a career. You eliminate the whites that the historical elite, and you replace them, and everybody can go up. So that's a good thing for them. But the business owners, right, when they hear that their children learn in class that working hard, being on time, studying hard are white supremacy culture, they lose them, right? And that's why they're all moving to the right. And so I was on the left. I'm still on the left in terms of like ecological transformation and social justice, the real social justice, not the not the ones that woke talk about. But I'm in despair about the left because I see all my friends, everyone is capitulating to the woke.
I see. I see it too. I mean, I'm gonna have a career as an academic.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. And you mentioned, and I talked about this years ago. You mentioned how what you call the ideological cartels, right? Which is really, and you mentioned 17th century Holland, but also 16th century England. You got to think, how did the British nation go from being a completely Catholic nation where Henry VIII was named the defender of the faith by the Pope,
right,
and in just a decade becomes a Protestant nation? Well, it becomes that because it's not by appealing to the peasantry, it's by appealing to the middle managers, the lords, and the clerics, the disgruntled clerics, which is exactly what happened and has been happening, and probably Europe the same as in the United States. And
are you aware with this?
In the academic realm, Go ahead.
Are you aware of the Spenglerian ideas? So he says that any civilization starts with what we call the pre-culture phase. That's when some nomadic group gets control of a territory and starts building roots. So they denomadize, but their capital is still moving around, like Charlemagne. So then, as they grow, you have the consolidation of the two estates, the priesthood and the military, and the chivalry, the knights.
Right.
Those are the two estates, right? As they grow, the cities evolve. And in the cities, you have the third estate. And the third estate will ally with the monarch against the estates. And that creates the nation. And the nation creates a fourth estate, which is the working class. That creates democracy, right? And then democracy degenerates and creates Caesarism. So that's kind of like the cycle described by Spengler.
Yeah. Yes.
And I see a lot of truth to that. I just I think he's got it right on that. It's exactly how that happens. And so what you describe in England and France, and so what Spengler actually brings to the table is to show that this happened in Islam, this happened in China, this happened in Japan. And I was totally surprised by reading that. I had no idea that land had been commodified in Byzantium and in Rome.
Wow.
We think these are like eminently modern capitalist things. No, it happened in Rome, it happened in Byzantium, it happened in China. And so we've reached the end of the road. We've reached the end of the road of a particular civilizational model.
Yeah.
And then we can go towards this integration, which is the 5 centuries after the Roman Empire.
And I think
we can go to something higher and more complex. We simplify by integrating the difference, right?
Now, when I read your work, I see and I see a kind of resonance with mine, because I think what I read, the subtext in your work is that you saw this collapse coming, and you were anticipating what kind of civilization we could build as this one falls apart. I mean, I saw that. I have to say, it came a little more swiftly than I thought it would, but I saw it coming.
Yeah.
So in 2018, I published a book, Transfiguration, which I saw that, and I said that
you're groping for this second eggshell revolution, right? That's what you're about, and I don't have the same spiritual schooling, but I think I consider wokeism the end of the road for immanentism, or for this kind of pseudo rationality, deficient rational mode.
Yeah.
Right. And what it tells me, because I'm a spiritual person, I'm not a particularly religious person. So I'm a bit in the situation of Jordan Peterson. Like, I know what I don't like, but it's hard for me to step over to the next, to the step of being like the person of faith. But I am animated by spiritual concerns.
Yeah.
Without any doubt. And I'm interested, and I read spiritual books and religious books, and but the thing is, so I think so I made some mistakes. One is that I had become myself a pure horizontalist. Somebody would ask me, what is your spirituality? I said, well, my engagement gives me all I need. I just can't find any space for anything else. But my engagement with fellow human beings trying to create a better world. It was enough until the moment I got canceled. And, I could also see the emptiness of these horizontal linkages, because the network doesn't have solidarity. That's something you learn very quickly, right? The network is people linking together by affinity. And as soon as they notice that the affinity is gone, they're also gone. So, like when I was attacked in 2018, most of my progressive friends just, nobody was there.
Oh, yeah, nobody had your back.
And this was at the personal level very, very hard to stomach, because I'd given like 15 years of my life, and 7 years working for free without income, and I lost what I had, and so that was very hard to take. And so the second thing where I think I was wrong was the smooth. I did hope for a smooth transition. Like going up high.
Right.
And as I've been reading more about past transitions, I've given that hope up. I think it never happened. Even when you say capital state nation was a higher synthesis, yeah, but after 3 centuries of civil war,
right,
and after enormous suffering for the working class and the dispossession of the farmers, right? So sure, yeah, but that wasn't in any way an easy and smooth operation either. But the third thing, whereas I think also I was wrong, was I didn't anticipate that the cultural disintegration would precede the ecological integration. Now, of course, they are linked. I don't dispute that.
Absolutely.
They are linked. But to be honest, wokeism like completely came. I didn't anticipate that. When I discovered it, I thought this is not possible. Like, this is such a low quality thinking. This is such a primitive scapegoating mechanism.
Mm-hmm, absolutely.
A few crazy students, but that it would take over all the institutions in less than 5 years, I didn't see it coming.
Right? Well, I saw it coming, but I didn't. Pardon me. I didn't think it would gain so much power. Yeah. You know what I mean? And well, what I didn't see is I didn't see how the corporations and government acquiescing to it.
No.
And I was surprised. That's what really, and it happened. So, and when you pointed to the protests against the bankers and the 1% in was what 2007 or 2008, right? But that was part of
2011, was it? 2011.
Well, I'm thinking 2008 when Barack Obama was elected.
Right. Yeah, it
was very much. And I remember telling friends back then, I said he's not the savior. It's just rhetoric. He's just another neocon. Right. Trust me, he's good. Right. And they thought, oh, you're a racist. You don't want to have a black one. No. I've been teaching black people for 30 years. I have no problem with people who are black and being in power, but he's just a neocon. And what they use, and what happened, I think, is the governments across the world use the language of the woke as a tool of oppression.
Yeah, it's diversifying the elite against the people. It's an attempt to diversify the elite, to consolidate a group of people. And I think they don't have the numbers. They don't have the numbers to carry it out. That's why I'm hopeful. I was first hopeful that was so irrational it could never happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and then it happened. And so now, I think this is just, mathematically, in terms of numbers, you cannot rule against the people, right? Even a despot, a tyrant, needs legitimacy, and they don't have it.
No, they don't. And you can see it. And it's interesting. You mentioned the Dutch farmers, and I don't know what you're hearing in Thailand, but in the United States, there is nothing in the news media about what's going on.
No, you have to look for it. Yeah.
You have to, and that's why, in fact, I got on Twitter precisely because I felt when the protests were happening last year, must have been last year, and I couldn't hear anything about it. So I said, well, I got to find out someplace. My wife said, go on Twitter. It's all there, which I did. Of course, there's censorship there, but you can find some of these things that are going on.
If you choose the right people, there's ways.
But it is stunning. In fact, I just saw, I have to mention this. I just saw this story about some George Soros funded think tank in Ireland who's kind of has a list of broadcasters who need to be watched on Twitter and things like this. And right. I didn't see your name, but a lot of people you probably admire are on there. But this is the kind of thing we're talking about is you can tell that they're scared.
Yeah.
Because they see
it's
the working class united with, I would call it even a spiritual class, because I think what you're talking about where you were in the horizontal and you lost the vertical dimension. I mean, I think a lot of, and people even Rainer Fuelmich, do you know him?
No.
He's a German American lawyer, and he's like you. He says, I'm not really a religious person, but guess what? This is a spiritual battle.
Yeah.
You know,
well, I agree with that. I agree with that. And so the problem I see is, so I think we ended the cycle of the French Revolution, right? 1789, left and right.
Yeah.
So from that moment on, the religious debate is done. People no longer translate politics into religion. They go directly to politics and they fight, around ideologies and class interests and stuff like that. 1848, the left becomes working class, because before it was the bourgeois radicals, right? It's only after 1848 that it becomes like the working class movement. And then 89, kills off the utopia, definitely.
Mm-hmm.
And then the left slowly and actually quite fast becomes the party of the proletariat, of the educated people in the cities.
Yeah.
And they drift more and more separate from the working class until they actually theorize it. I think in the early 2000s, you have these reports coming out from think tanks saying, oh, we should become a coalition of minorities. And, so that's when they go completely, not woke fully, but the premises are there.
Yeah.
That they're no longer working class parties. And so the working class gets alienated and now expresses itself in these right-wing populist movements. And so paradoxically, even though I think they don't pay sufficient attention to climate change and ecological issues, and they're very often like market ideologues and stuff, I still think that something may happen on that side. And that's why what I see happening in the US with national conservatism, with New Polity, and at least in terms of thinking, you see something happening. And then, of course, you have Poland and Hungary, which are nationalistic, sovereignist parties, but with a strong solidaristic aspect, right? Hungary spends 2% of its GDP on family support. So if you have 2 children, you actually get some kind of basic income from the government.
Right. And you notice also with those countries, there is a genuine commitment to the family.
Yeah.
Which you don't see in most of the rest of the West. I mean, certainly you don't see it in the United States.
No.
Right.
But it wasn't always that way. My working class labor parties that I know in my youth were pro-family.
Yeah, same with mine. I was Democrat. I didn't know what a Republican was when I was a kid. I grew up in a working class city.
We
Detroit.
Actually the child support and holidays for kids and that was all working class parties that did that. Not even not the conservatives. They were the elite back in the day.
I seriously don't think I met a conservative till I was in my 20s. Because everybody around me they were all working class Democrats.
I just started because of the woke cancellation. I said, okay, if that is happening with the left, I really need to broaden my intake, because this is, they're no longer thinking.
Yeah.
Like they're just not thinking. They're not reading. They're, saying things that are completely wrong about people, like about Jordan Peterson.
Mm-hmm.
I checked 8 different charges and they all turned out to be false.
Yeah.
Because I'm a librarian. I'm a very good searcher. So I spent like 2-3 weeks doing this.
Yeah.
Can that be true? And it always turned out not to be true.
Yeah.
Like, no, he doesn't want to force women to marry at gunpoint. Never said it, never thought it.
Mm-hmm.
And so to see, my leftist friends going down that kind of route, whereas, when I was young, I had teachers like Ernest Mandela, the leader of the Fourth International, was my professor.
Yeah.
But these guys were real scholars. Like they read and they didn't distort. We might disagree or agree with what they said, but apart from agreeing or disagreeing, what they said was documented.
Well, and there was substance to it, and I think we've seen in the last certainly 15 years, maybe more, on the left is not a commitment to ideas. I mean, if you look back in the United States, for instance, in the 60s, to people like John F. Kennedy or Martin Luther King or Robert Kennedy, who are not only were they dedicated to social justice, but they were extraordinarily articulate men with, really, there was a philosophical underpinning of what they were saying, and they had the gravitas to say it. But it seems like in the last 15 years or so, the left, at least in this country, and I think in Europe, is more committed to a kind of rhetoric. It's rhetoric. It's rhetoric. It's just language, and it's really language.
It's moralism. It's moralism.
And its aim is power. And its aim is power. Is amassing power for themselves.
So
not in spreading.
There's
truth.
a Swedish Marxist. There was a Swedish Marxist, Malcolm Kieneke. I'm not sure about his last name, but he says, what is happening now is a consuming fear of proletarization, right? So the cognitive class is itself very precarious, and I know because I am one. You're living project by project. You don't have a fixed wage,
right?
And it's the enduring fear is I don't want to work in McDonald's. I don't want to work in Starbucks, which a lot of them do. Right. And has created like a fear. And I think 2008 is a switch from an abundance thinking to a scarcity thinking, right? Yeah. So I was on board with inclusion and diversity till then. Why? Because sure, I want, any institution to reflect the richness of the people who live in the country.
Yeah.
And why are 80% whites? And actually, I was on board with that when it meant, taking people in, right?
Yeah.
So the idea was this place for everyone.
Yeah.
With woke it changed. It's like I can only advance if you go down, right? So it's a win-lose scarcity-based paradigm.
And it's the funny thing is it's mostly white people making those rules, right?
Yeah, I know. But it's akin to fascism because it's a group going down. So traditionally, progressivism is groups that have a hope to get better.
Yeah.
And fascism are groups that have no hope to get better and want to keep what they have or are angry because they lost it, right? And René Girard makes an interesting distinction. So he says, the extreme right is Satanists and the extreme left is the Antichrist. And what he means is the following. The kind of fascist-like radical right identifies with the victimizer, right? They will talk about certain people and we'll call them vermin, and they want to smash them and make them suffer. Right. The radical left is extreme identification with victimization, right? And so what intersectionality has done, it has unified all forms of victimization, provided at the top there's the cis white male, right? And that justifies everybody down can exist as a victim because there's this one thing holding it all together.
Yeah,
happens to be us.
Yeah.
And so they displace the class issue to the race issue and the gender issue, right? They mention class, but it's only rhetoric. They don't mean it. They never ask somebody like about their financial privilege. Doesn't exist. Never happens. It's always about gender and race, which happens to be very serviceable to the elite. So they're now no longer being criticized. They're no longer 1%.
Yep,
it's perfect.
And to flex the attention from them.
Yeah,
give you something else to fight about. Well, we're probably getting toward the end here. I know it's getting late in Thailand. I want to thank you so much for doing this, Michel. And I wonder if there's anything you could leave our listeners with to think about what to work toward as a people, as a commons.
Right. Well, in one way, I'm extremely pragmatic. I think what is important now is to ensure, as an individual, like, where is your solidarity coming from? Like, will you have access to food, to energy, to transport, to housing? And if not, where can you get it? And in that sense, mutualizing is really a very good option, right? So there's things that you can't afford on your own that you can afford if you get together as a group.
Yeah.
So and this is what urban commoning is about, or even rural commoning is about. It's about, going back to the essentials.
Yeah.
Because the market is not going to provide them, and even the state, it's doubtful whether it's going to succeed in even with rationing, and so I think going back to co-ops and local, that's all very important. And at the same time, I think, don't stay at the local in terms of thinking, ally yourself. And then I think, maybe because I'm an intellectual, but I think to preserve quality thinking, to preserve personal integrity, to create spaces where you can have dialogues with people who are different. I know it's not very exciting, but
no, it is. No, it is. It's important. I mean,
yeah.
In a way, it's what we used to take for granted as kids, right?
Yeah. We have to strengthen the seeds, right? We can't win right now.
Mm-hmm.
We can't. But the system is disintegrating, right? So you have one water level is going down, another water level is going up slowly.
Yeah.
Right. And at some point it switches. I can't say when, I can't say how, but it's the things we're doing now to organize, empirically working alternatives that are going to make the difference in the next 10 to 15, 20 years.
Yeah, that's good. Well, yeah, I mean, we plant an apple tree, you don't know if you're going to be there to get the fruit.
Right.
It's the deed. All right. Well, thank you so much, Michel. It's just been such a pleasure.
It's a pleasure,
I can keep going.
I hope we stay in touch, and I
Please
hope,
do.
I'm open to any collective intellectual projects, and
yeah, me too.
I love your work. I've read your book. I watched your 8 episodes.
Okay.
I found it extremely, extremely interesting and inspiring.
Thanks a lot, and your work really inspires me. And we got to get you on here with Guido. That would be a wonderful conversation.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. Yeah, I look forward to that. I think, there's nothing more important than connecting people like us now.
Yeah, well, so we'll do. Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much. That was really a pleasure, and we'll see you next time. And everybody, we'll see you next week on the Regeneration podcast.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you.